So I know Prime Video sucks. You know it sucks. I mean, they do offer some good movies, but you've got to dig. And that's what I did for this video. I dug deep and I found 20 excellent movies buried deep on Prime Video. These are movies Prime Video's not likely to recommend to you, but I'm gonna recommend them here. Let's start with my number 20 pick, which is actually an Edgar Allan Poe flick, The Raven. Now, this is not based on Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Rather, this is a work of fiction. It's a crime movie where somebody is carrying out these vicious murders based on the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, and a detective recruits Poe to help him solve these murders. There's a movie very similar to this on Netflix called The Pale Blue Eye. I thought that movie was a bit too slow to warrant a second watch, but The Raven's actually pretty exciting. This is actually from the same director as V for Vendetta and Ninja Assassin, two very different movies, and The Raven's fairly different from those, but it's still got this dark, macabre feel, and is fairly fast-paced for an Edgar Allan Poe murder mystery movie. My number 19 pick on this list is, without a doubt, the darkest movie ever directed by Kevin Smith. It's titled Red State. This is pretty much a horror movie, but what makes it so interesting is not just Kevin Smith as the director, but it's got an interesting cast. Melissa Leo and Michael Parks are kind of the heavy hitters in this movie, but you've also got John Goodman, Stephen Root, Kyle Gallner, and a couple familiar faces from Breaking Bad. Kevin Smith actually explores a lot of really interesting ideas here, and ideas beyond just the core concept of these like far right-wing Christian nut jobs. Like horror-wise, there's some interesting things that unfold in this movie. Ultimately, I didn't love where this thing ended up, or rather, I don't think Kevin Smith really put a bow on it the way he could have, but that said, it's still a very interesting project from Smith. My next one is another horror movie that's a good pick for Halloween, but it's a horror comedy, and I've only got 4 really appropriate ones for Halloween on this list of 20, but my next pick is Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, a movie that came out kind of on the tail end of the big zombie craze we had about a decade ago, and I think a lot of people passed on it as a result, but this is an exceptionally funny movie. Now, it's raunchier and kind of more, let's say, juvenile than something like Shaun of the Dead, but that's because you're following some teenage boys fighting zombies in this movie. In fact, tone-wise, this fits in a lot more with Zombieland than it would Shaun of the Dead. In fact, I'll say Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse would make a great pairing with Zombieland, much more so than the sequel to Zombieland did. But next up, we've got another murder mystery, but this is a slow-paced one, and it was directed by Sean Penn. It's titled The Pledge.
Body of a young girl has just been found.
She was a second grader. I guess that put her about 7.5, 8.
Jack Nicholson plays a retiring detective in this, which I know is a little bit cliche, but the last case he's presented with is one that he just cannot let go. He basically devotes his life to pursuing this case. Benicio del Toro has a short-lived but very bizarre role in this movie as well. I would say for people who love murder mystery stuff, this is an excellent little gem, again, directed by Sean Penn, that went largely unnoticed, but The Pledge is so slowly paced that if you're not really into this genre from the start, I don't know that there's going to be enough there for you to grab onto. Thanks to BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. BetterHelp's mission has been to make therapy affordable and accessible. A good therapist can be pretty expensive, but depending on where you live, a good therapist could be impossible to find. But it's super simple to get started with BetterHelp. Just by answering a few basic questions, BetterHelp is going to pair you with a therapist that's best matched for you within about 48 hours. As someone who's tried therapy, I did it remotely, just like you would with BetterHelp, and I found it really beneficial. I only needed to do it for a handful of months before I felt happier, healthier. I think since doing that, I've been a better husband and a better father. Talking to a qualified professional with BetterHelp is easy and comfortable, but if for some reason you don't like the therapist they paired you up with, you can easily make a switch and you don't have to worry about who's in your network or insurance or any of that junk. And again, it could not be easier to get started with this. All you need to do is follow the link down in the video description or just type in betterhelp.com/flickconnection and you're going to save 10% off your first month. And you don't need to suffer from things like chronic depression in order to benefit from talking to a therapist. I have looked at it as a personal growth tool. I feel like I understand myself better since doing that, and I have better tools that help me cope with problem solving in my life, which has really just led to better emotional well-being overall. So again, to get started and to get that discount, use my link or just go to betterhelp.com/flickconnection. But let's get back to the movies on this list. Now, my next recommendation is actually two movies. It's the original and the remake of Bad Lieutenant. But listen closely, because these movies are not just weird, they're also pretty off-putting.
How much do they say? $500.
Money now. Got it.
Now, the original stars Harvey Keitel as a bad lieutenant, and it actually came out in 1992, which I'm surprised by. I always thought this movie was considerably older, like 10 years or more, but no, 1992. And he's a corrupt New York City police detective. He's got a serious drug and gambling addiction. And yes, there is a plot, but the movie is much more of a character study on this bad lieutenant character. And he does some heinous stuff in this movie. Literally things I will not repeat just for the sake of like turning people's stomachs. So this one is not for the faint of heart. Trust me on that. And then you've got the remake, which bizarrely stars Nicolas Cage, and even more bizarrely, was directed by Werner Herzog. Herzog's famous for a lot of some of the world's greatest documentaries, and he's done a handful of movies, this being one of them, but to pursue a remake of such a bizarre Harvey Keitel movie from 1992 is a weird choice. He makes some weird choices as the director, and then of course, you know, in typical Nicolas Cage fashion, he makes some weird choices in terms of the performance. Now, if you watch the show enough, you know that once a month or so, maybe less, I'll recommend an anime movie that I found to be particularly interesting. I am not an anime guy, but when I find one that I really like, I do love to share it, and that's what I've got for you right here with Wicked City. Now, this one is surprisingly from 1987. Now, it does look like it's very much from the 80s, but the mood and style of this movie is so slick, it looks like something that was made long after the 80s were completed. And it's a neo-noir thing, or at least it's like a neon noir type of a movie. You follow a detective, but there's a major supernatural element with Wicked City. There are like these demonic others, this other species of people that are demon-based. It's like the most I want to say, because figuring out what's going on is a big part of the movie. But you do get some bizarre body horror and things in this movie, very much like John Carpenter's The Thing, crossed with the movie Drive with Ryan Gosling. Like, if that sounds cool to you and you've never seen an anime before, give this one a few minutes, see if you could get into it. I will say this one is loaded with sexual content, so make sure the kids are in bed for this one. But again, if you often like some of the moodier 80s vibe stuff that I recommend here, Wicked City is pretty badass. All right, next up, I've got another horror comedy. It's a good one, though, especially if you get into the sense of humor in the clips I'm about to show you in Onyx the Fortuitous and the Talisman of Souls.
I've been invited to Bartok's mansion to take part in a once-in-a-lifetime ritual in which he, along with 5 of his most loyal followers, will attempt to raise the spirit of the ancient demon, Abaddon.
You're not going anywhere until you scoop that litter box.
That is Andrew Bowser playing Onyx the Fortuitous. He also wrote and directed this movie. This is a pretty small project, but it's all about his Onyx character, and I find it to be incredibly hilarious. I'll even say I watched this with the wife, and we were both skeptical. We thought that the sense of humor was going to wear thin, or at least this bizarre character was going to wear thin, and it did not. He managed to keep this thing funny all the way through. There are a lot of hysterical moments in this flick. And even though his character is kind of obnoxious, like, he's also endearing, and you want to watch him. You want to see what happens to him all the way through. It's also worth noting this movie has a bizarre amount of practical effects for something this small, and they're all quite funny and pretty good looking as well. It's been a while since I've seen a horror comedy that was also like this warm and inviting. I would relate this one the most to Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Very different plot, but in terms of the overall mood and sense of comedy you get from it, it's the closest relation I could make. I'll even go one step further. I'll say that Andrew has a YouTube channel that I subscribe to, and he puts out skits as this Onyx character, and they're just as funny as the movie.
For I am death by way of physical therapy. I am hell by way of the backstroke. I am the pool from Night Swim.
Next up, I've got one that's directed by George Clooney that they did not market as being directed by George Clooney because his movies are hit and miss, but The Boys in the Boat is a hit. So yeah, Clooney has directed some really amazing movies I absolutely love, and he's also done a few that I thought were just absolutely awful, but The Boys in the Boat makes for a fantastic sports movie. This story revolves around the University of Washington's rowing team. It takes place in the 1930s, and all of the people on this team struggled greatly through the Great Depression. And this movie tracks their journey from training all the way up to competing against the Germans in the Olympics. Again, this is prior to World War II, so this is a major story, and the movie is just expertly done. If you typically like sports-oriented movies, The Boys in the Boat is a fantastic one, but I'm telling you, even if you don't, and even if you have no interest in rowing whatsoever, this movie is still so good and so enjoyable. I recommend it for everyone. Don Cheadle makes the list with what is probably like his most underrated movie, even though it's one that he has like starred in the most. It's titled Traitor. While this one does have a fair amount of action in it, it's PG-13 and it doesn't really have the teeth that a story like this should have, but it does have a fair amount of action in it, even though you would not really call this an action movie. Don Cheadle's great, but you also got a great role from Guy Pearce in this. The movie's got a slick look, it's got a bunch of twists and turns where you're not really gonna know what's happening. It's a fairly exciting movie, even if it feels a little bit dated today. Speaking of underrated though, my next pick is underrated despite the fact that it stars Naomi Watts, Ewan McGregor, and Ryan Gosling in Stay. Now this movie is nearly 20 years old already, but it is one hell of a mystery flick. McGregor plays a psychiatrist who's trying to prevent one of his young patients, played by Ryan Gosling, from committing suicide, but through this process, he begins to lose his grip on reality. Weird things begin happening. So what starts out as like a mysterious movie ends up being a real mind bender, one that I can't really say much about. This director also did Finding Neverland and Monsters Ball. And Stay is an excellent movie, but it does deal with some pretty upsetting subject matter. Suicide is a pretty heavy theme. It's one of the major focal points of the mystery in this movie, but that said, I still highly recommend this flick. It's just not one that you want to flip on a whim. Believe it or not, I've got a Woody Allen flick coming up next, but it's a highly underrated one. It's one he did that's way outside the realm of what he normally does. In fact, Match Point feels a lot more like an Alfred Hitchcock flick than it does a Woody Allen movie. In this movie, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers plays an ex-tennis pro who gets wrapped up in a love triangle with Scarlett Johansson, which is honestly pretty understandable, but when things get out of hand, the things that he does as a result are actually pretty shocking. Now, this is a slow-paced movie. You've got to be into the Alfred Hitchcock style of a thriller. In fact, Match Point feels unusually old-fashioned in that sense. You have to wait quite a while for the payoff in this movie, but you've got a bunch of great actors carrying you through the thing, and honestly, you know, Woody Allen is one of the top directors of all time, so it's interesting to see him tackle a different genre. I think he nailed it with this one. The movie's damn near pitch perfect, again, for patient viewers. Now, similar to Onyx the Fortuitous, I've got another actor, writer, director in a movie that's pretty much a comedy, but it happens to be one of the best movies about pool players ever made outside of The Hustler. In fact, I would actually rank Poolhall Junkies above The Color of Money, directed by Martin Scorsese, which I know is a bold statement. Now, it doesn't have the craftsmanship or the polish of a Martin Scorsese movie, but Poolhall Junkies is thoroughly entertaining. And you get a great role from Christopher Walken in this movie. Now, Mars Callahan stars in this movie. He wrote and directed it as well. He's done a few other things, but this is far and away the best project he's ever done. He plays a pool hustler. The movie's got a lot of really funny moments in it, but also some pretty tense games of pool. And some of the dialogue is admittedly dated. This movie's well over 20 years old. And I think even this first scene, they're discussing like who gets to use the N-word. So again, it feels pretty dated, but still thoroughly entertaining. And again, you do not have to know anything about billiards to enjoy Poolhall Junkies. Technically, there are 2 horror movies left on the list. Far and away though, the scariest one has got to be Pandorum. This is one of the better space horror movies ever released. Obviously, it falls way behind the original Alien, but in terms of other movies like Event Horizon, I put Pandorum up there with those. I think some of the twists in Pandorum feel a little bit generic, a little bit too generic for how cool the rest of the movie is. That said though, the movie starts off with just a real interesting hook. You follow Ben Foster. He wakes up inside of a sleep chamber to discover he's the only person awake on this massive, dark, extremely dark spaceship. From there, he's got to figure out what's going on, and there are things crawling around in the dark on this ship. Now, as it turns out, he's not the only person. He does run into some other folks, so it's not like Castaway where Ben Foster is really having to carry the movie by himself. But Pandorum has really tense horror elements. Again, you're crawling around in the dark on this creepy spaceship, but it's also got a fair amount of action packed into it as well. And it's R-rated, so it does have the teeth that a movie like this needs and deserves. Next up, I've got another murder mystery, but this one feels very realistic, very grounded, and it's the movie that made Jennifer Lawrence such a huge star. It's titled Winter's Bone. In this movie, Jennifer Lawrence plays a teenage hillbilly girl out in the Ozarks when her father goes missing, and she begins to investigate what happened to him. What makes Winter's Bone so interesting is she's this young girl who's very headstrong, but she has to navigate kind of these bizarre social circles in this hillbilly community. So she's investigating people that she knows, you know, friends of the family, people who obviously know what happened but don't want to share. So right off the bat, it's an interesting setup for a detective style story and an interesting setting. Then on top of that, she's fantastic, especially at such a young age. It's really well directed, and you get other amazing performances. John Hawkes is incredible in this movie. He's not in it that much, but when he's there, he's just one of my favorite actors, and this is an amazing role from him. I mean, if you love murder mysteries and you've somehow never seen Winter's Bone, put it at the top of your watch list. But another murder mystery movie that also stars John Hawkes and takes place in a small community is titled Small Town Crime, but this is a very different type of movie.
What is that, blood in there? Yeah. It's gonna be extra.
Now this too is neo-noir. He actually is playing a private detective that has a pretty serious drinking problem, and he's investigating a potential murder in a fairly small town. But the dialogue in this movie is clever, but not too clever, or, you know, it doesn't take you out of the movie. Like I said, John Hawkes is great, but you've got other great actors like Robert Forster. It's one of his last roles. Clifton Collins Jr. His character's out of left field in this movie, but it's a really fun addition. And the movie's just got a spark. It's one I've been recommending for several years now, and I don't always see it available on streaming, but it jumps around, and right now it's on Prime, and I'm telling you, this is a good example of one that you would never see come across your screen if I didn't recommend it.
Is that all you bringing? That musket?
It's a high-quality musket, son.
But another crime movie that a lot of you probably seen, but that I know Prime Video is just not going to give a strong recommendation for, is The Bank Job, starring Jason Statham. This is among one of his better movies. I mean, this is a traditional heist flick, but it's a great traditional heist flick. In fact, it's so traditional, it takes place in the 70s. They're all communicating on these gigantic brick-style walkie-talkies with huge antennas. The whole vibe of that is just fantastic and fun, but it's actually a very elaborate heist that they're planning, executing, and then trying to get away with. All the standard beats you know and love, and that's what's great about The Bank Job, is it's got all of them in there. All right, now we're into my top 4. Looking at the list, they all qualify as dramas, but Each one of them is unique in their own way. My number 4 pick is titled The Cooler. This takes place in Vegas, and it's kind of the transition from old Vegas to new Vegas, or at least that's what the movie tries to capture. William H. Macy plays a cooler, a unlucky man who is hired by the casinos to go to tables and literally cool them off. When the action's too hot, he's so miserable and so unlucky that just sitting at the table cools them off. Now, apparently this was a real practice that casinos used to employ. Obviously, it doesn't really work, but in terms of this movie, they play it up like there's a bit of folklore there, like it might actually be real. Alec Baldwin's fantastic in this movie. Whenever he plays an asshole, I love it. Like, his character in The Departed is one of my favorites he's ever played.
I'm glad to hear that.
And this is similar. Like, he's a tough guy in this movie, but he sells it. Maria Bello has a great role in this as well, and the movie's actually surprisingly sweet, but it's also just a solid, well-acted drama. This is one that was done on a very small budget that was kind of a surprise hit when it came out, relatively compared to its size. And I think that's because it's so easily likable. Now, my next pick comes from France. You can either read subtitles or listen to the English dubbed version, but unlike Netflix, that's not a setting you can change. You have to pick the version, the one that says English dub if that's what you want, with Brotherhood of the Wolf, a movie that has turned into a cult classic that would make a pretty fantastic Halloween watch, but you wouldn't quite call this a horror movie. In fact, this actually has a lot in common with The Hound of the Baskervilles. There's this wolf creature that's killing livestock and killing people, and these two outsiders are brought in to help solve the mystery and hunt this thing down. The movie itself is actually fairly long. In fact, the first half, there's a lot of interpersonal stuff going on, and it takes a while for you to even really get down to the mystery of this creature. But the whole thing's interesting. It's got some weird martial arts stuff that feels a little bit out of place. And again, it's a drama. It's not really an action movie, even though there's some action in it. You've also got Monica Bellucci, who is just absolutely smoking hot in this movie, and Vincent Cassel in a fairly action-packed and exciting fantasy story. I don't think it's quite fantasy either. It's pretty fantastic though, which is a reason why it's got this cult following now. My next pick stars Ray Stevenson, Christopher Walken, Vincent D'Onofrio, Val Kilmer, Linda Cardellini, and Vinnie Jones in Kill the Irishman.
I'm an Irish Catholic with the grace of God on my shoulder. If any of these maggots from the so-called mafia want to come after me, I'm not a hard man to find.
This is based on the true story of Danny Green. He was a tough Irish thug who worked for the mob in the 1970s, and then when he decided he didn't really want to work for the mob anymore, they tried to kill him, and they had a hell of a time trying to kill this guy. This movie has the most attempts on someone's life I think I've ever seen. It's got the most car bombs I've ever seen. It is one hell of a gangster movie. I mean, honestly, if you have any love for the genre, if you're a big fan of movies like Goodfellas, the way I am, Kill the Irishman fits right in with all of that, and it is amazing. It's its own unique story about a guy who's like kind of on the outskirts, who just, again, is impossible to kill. And honestly, out of everything in this genre, it's one of the more fun gangster movies you could possibly watch, at least one that's not a comedy. It's just ridiculous, some of the stuff that actually happened to this guy and around him in his life. And then speaking of Goodfellas, my next pick stars Nicolas Cage as a real-life arms dealer in what I consider to be the Goodfellas of arms dealing, Lord of War. Now, this is loosely based on the real story of Victor Bout. You may have heard of him in the news. He was a Russian arms dealer that we exchanged somewhat recently, so he's still making headlines. But his name was changed for Lord of War, and I imagine a lot of the story has, but this is a stunning movie. The cinematography is beautiful, the locations are amazing. Nicolas Cage is fantastic. He very rarely plays it over the top in this movie, and when he does, it's appropriate. It actually shows you how the process works. I mean, the opening credits to this movie are amazing. The style and direction is pretty exceptional on this as well. There's a lot of flair to it, but it's all appropriate. It never feels out of place or really too over the top. This is just a top-notch flick. It's one of Nicolas Cage's best and most underrated. Again, Prime Video's probably not going to recommend it to you, but if it sounds like you, put it on your watch list, watch it soon. Don't forget to go check out the BetterHelp link if you feel like you could benefit from talking to someone. I do recommend it. Again, that link is down in the video description, but I will keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Prime Video episode, and you will see me on the next one.